or rather reform of investment in the European Union called InvestEU. So I guess let's start with a broad question. How do you do more with less? Let's start with you, Mr. Stubb.
Sure. Yeah. Is it working? No.
Here you go.
More with less, clearly. Thanks, and thanks a lot for the kind words of introduction and for the invitation. I guess the first observation is that's a great one-liner from Jean-Claude Juncker if he's used it, because I think we had a seminar in Brussels organized by the EIB with that title. We don't claim any copyright on this, but it's good. The basic idea is very simple. Public money and resources, in other words, grants and subsidies, they're scarce. They're sort of a resource which is coming down. We mentioned in the introduction Brexit, for instance. So we have to learn how to live with less public money. And then the question is, what is there to replace it? And our basic idea, of course, at the EIB is that, well, we have budget guarantees and financial instruments and equity loans where basically we come in from the public sector, put in a certain bit, and then crowd in a whole bunch of private investment. So that's the basic thinking. And to give you the figures, out of the EU budget is about 150 billion euros a year, approximately, roughly. Depends a little bit on the year. And the bottom line is that only small portions of that budget are actually budget guarantees or financial instruments. So from 2007 to 2014, it was about 2% of that 150 billion euros. 2014 to 2020, it was 3%. And what the Commission proposes today is that we increase it up to 4%. And that's what they mean when they say, let's do more with less. Let's use more financial instruments rather than direct grants. That's the bottom line.
Care to react?
No. I think what Alex said is exactly in line with the EIB philosophy, and very much reflects the fact that when you look at this InvestEU instrument, which is it's a proposal from the European Commission, so obviously it will be still discussed by the governments, by the European Parliament, part of trialogue. But if you look at the basic philosophy of the InvestEU, it is very much in line with what is now part of Juncker plan, the European Fund for Strategic Investments. So it's like a large FC or large Juncker plan arrangement. The EIB has been managing European Fund for Strategic Investments for the last almost 3 years. And the idea is, as Alex mentioned, it is about utilizing the scarce public resources, and by leveraging, it means by bringing private sector investors, by bringing other public sector investors to create an investment impact which will be much bigger. So if you look at the European Fund for Strategic Investments, actually it's not a fund itself. There is no fund per se. It's a set of guarantees. There is, at least in the first part of the FC, was 16 billion from the EU budget and 5 billion from the EIB capital. So altogether 25 billion euro of budget guarantees, which are supposed to create an overall investment impact of 350 billion euro, which we believe will achieve by the end of June of this year. So it's a great way how to utilize public money to achieve maximum in terms of the investment impact. And the InvestEU is very much the same philosophy. It's translated into the new programmatic area, and we believe that EIB should and could play a major role in making sure that this money is utilized in the best way.
So basically the gap left by Apologies. So basically the gap left by Britain's exit from the EU is forcing the European Union to utilize funds more effectively. On the other hand, the budget of the European Union stays pretty much the same for the last couple of years, and yet we have seen a certain choppiness to investments. What has been the reason for the investment volatility? Is it the high amount of debt, or is it basically just the aftershock, the hangover from the financial crisis? What have been the determinants of the choppy investment in Europe in the last 10 years?
Well, sure, it's a big question, but let's start with Britain first. The two impacts of Brexit, sort of in crude accounting terms. One is to the EU budget. I just mentioned it's 150 billion a year. The UK share is approximately 12 to 14 billion euros. So that's how much it hits all of the EU funding that we see around. The second impact is on us, the EIB, because we're owned by the 28 member states. And we have what we call paid-in capital, so what the member states have paid in over the years. As far as the UK is concerned, it's 3.5 billion euros. So we need to replace that 3.5 billion euros in order for us to keep our capital level, and in order for us basically to continue as a bank that can provide loans and guarantees. Now, as far as the investment climate in the past 10 years being choppy, it's probably very much linked actually to the volatility of the European markets and the euro. I mean, I was in government from 2008 to 2016, which I tell the Finnish people is probably the worst time in Finnish economic history, so never elect me again. Because when I came, everything started going sour because of Lehman Brothers, and when I left, now the employment figures are great and growth is working again. So impact is big. But the basic idea of the EIB, and especially Vasil mentioned the Juncker plan, was in 2014. You know, Juncker came to our offices in Luxembourg, sat down with our president Werner Hoyer and said, listen, I'm a Spitzenkandidat, I want to become the Commission President, and I need to get investments going in Europe, because you know we are in a very difficult situation, we can't give more money, but we need to get investments going. And the idea of the Juncker plan was born. And as a matter of fact, this summer in July, first phase of it's over. We put down guarantees of 21 billion and it's generated investments of 315 billion euros. Volatility in investments in general, I don't think you can sort of put your finger on it and say this is the reason for it and that, so on and so forth. But the way in which we try to do it at the EIB is to try to help out to sort of bring the volatility down and go into places and crowd in investment from other players. Final point on this, we're a AAA bank from here to ad infinitum, I hope. And the reason for it is that we're owned by the 28 member states. And it's very unlikely that one of the 28 member states will go bankrupt. And we're a fully mutualized bank as well. So, you know, we're tied to each other. We're completely dependent on each other. Member states put money into the bank. We invest, generate surplus. If something goes sour, the whole bank goes sour. So we try to crowd in people, and people trust us, and I think that's a good thing.
You mentioned 2014 as a sort of turnout year. I wonder how much the investment turnout had to do with Mr. Juncker and his plans, and perhaps how much of that can be attributed to the non-traditional measures undertaken by the ECB.
Yeah. Well, I can give you the EIB figures. By our calculations, we have a fairly strong economics department. The EIB's impact on the European economy since 2014-2015 up until 2020 will be 2.3% of GDP. That's the EIB. Out of that, 0.4% is FC and the Juncker plan. Then, of course, you might want to pose a follow-up question. Well, would the investments have happened without the EIB? Perhaps, perhaps not. But I think that's kind of an irrelevant question because we were the ones who were able to generate the investment in any case. As far as the ECB is concerned, you know, they deal with monetary policy, right? So they are the ones who say they will do everything in their power. They are the ones who let the money. They are the ones who regulate inflation. They are the ones who basically back up the rescue plans. We don't. We just do it for investment. And the basic idea is very simple. We go into a project max 50%, and when we go into it, we suddenly see a lot of other players coming in as as well. So we are part of a bigger wheel, if you will. We're a small part of a bigger wheel, and we're trying to do our best to basically make the internal market in Europe work.
If I may, on these investment issues, I think we need to realize that the EU budget represents around 1% of the overall European GNP, and on the expenditure side, it represents around 2% of the total EU public expenditures. So it's a very small part of the overall European public coffers. That's why majority of responsibility for investments is really on the national level or subnational level, and these national governments. This both in terms of how much they actually give into investment purposes. And if you look at Slovakia, actually the Slovak level of public investments has been decreasing. And this was very much, on one hand, due to the consolidation efforts. And we know that after the financial crisis, and when I was State Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, and when in 2012, when I joined, we were running a deficit of more than 8% of GDP. Obviously, the main focus was on how to decrease the deficit and also how to consolidate and how to gradually decrease the public debt. Also, we have debt ceilings, debt break, which is a constitutional arrangement in Slovakia, which basically limits the debt to 50%, and then once you get over 50%, you already have very serious consequences for the government. And this also creates a problem in terms of public investments. For example, today I had a meeting with Minister Eršek, Minister of Transport. It was mostly about the ring road around Bratislava, which you know very well, and where the EIB is the main investor, over 400 million euro of investments into this PPP project. But basically when we spoke about the needs of Slovakia in terms of transport and road construction, he said, yes, we have a lot of needs, but I don't have money to do it because the EU resources, EU funds have been already allocated. And Minister Kazimír will not allow me to spend any more money from the state coffers. So, and of course, if you talk to Minister Kazimír, he will tell you, yes, because we have that break, it's the constitutional law, and when we are trying to agree with the opposition parties to actually change the debt break, we did not succeed. So there are these issues which are all, of course, impacting the overall investment climate. One way we are looking at this also from the EIB perspective at the European level is that because we are a public development bank, so we always, when we invest into some project, we have to demonstrate an added value, additionality. It means that we have to demonstrate we are not replacing commercial lenders, commercial banks, institutions, but we go into projects where those commercial lenders for some reason don't go. And as part of this, we also have to show that this contribution is leveraged by the private money, and this is where we focus. In the post-crisis time, most of the market gaps which we were filling were related to crisis situation. Now we see the change in the market gaps from typical cyclical market gaps related to the crisis to more systemic or what do you call it, structural market gaps, which are related to what I think the topic is, which is related to innovation, to competitiveness, and to investing into those areas which are important for Europe in terms of the competitiveness.
So you touched upon the subject of austerity. Nowadays, it's Brexit taking away our funds, if I may be so simplistic. In the past few years, we have seen some belt tightening, whereas other parts of the global economy might have not been as austere as Europe. Is that part of a disadvantage for Europe, the focus on balanced budgets? Perhaps you could comment?
Well, the answer is no. I actually think it's part of the solution. I happen to come from a country which probably belonged to the strongest austerity camp throughout the financial crisis. Not only that, I think we were a bit of an economic miracle from 1991 to 2007. We had GDP growth per annum per capita 1,500 euros. That was more than any other nation could benefit from globalization, from open economies. Then came Lehman Brothers 2008. I remember being in my first budget negotiations in August 2008. This is August 2008, so right after the war in Georgia, and before Lehman Brothers, and top economist in Finland, Bank of Finland, finance minister saying, wow, I'm predicting growth 3.4% for next year. Minus 6% later. We had to pump in approximately 10 billion euros of additional debt. The idea was to be as Keynesian as possible. In other words, get money into public works, roads, bridges, railways, you name it. That obviously didn't work. One of the reasons was that we had structural problems. We were not competitive enough. And we were trying sort of to catch up throughout. We didn't do the German type of reforms that were done in early 2000, and we've had to do that. So is austerity the wrong way to go about it? I mean, obviously, as a government minister, you want to avoid that situation because it's never popular to cut expenditure and cut benefits and social security. But at the same time, you have a job to have a balanced budget. You'll never hit it right, but I would still argue, and I'll make this my final point. Finland had its own currency ever since 1862, but it was always extremely volatile. A lot of inflationary pressure, devaluation, pegging to the gold standard, pegging to the dollar, pegging to the pound, and it was always run by big power politics, big state politics. And now with the euro, it's been completely different. We have a set of rules, we sit around the table where decisions about our currency are made, and we try to stick to those rules. So I would argue that the rules that we have, albeit they're not always followed, have been a blessing rather than a curse.
You mentioned that rules are not always followed to the letter. That is one way Europe is very heterogeneous. The other is perhaps the difference in investment. We can still see that countries which have been perhaps a little more austere, as Sweden or Germany or Austria, have recovered their investment in terms of GDP, whereas countries like, for example, Slovakia and other Baltic countries, for example, have not yet recovered in terms of investment. How do you explain this phenomena?
Well, I think we really need to look at the numbers, because I think the investments, especially when it comes to the private sector investments, have really grown tremendously in Slovakia and in these countries. Also, when you travel, and I was yesterday in Poland, in Katowice, you see a huge growth, huge progress. So I think that the change is there. The countries, and unfortunately, sometimes we are victims of this excellent economic growth, which was reflected in the new EU budget proposal, whereas the cohesion element was cut, especially for the Central European countries, because we have been able to grow radically in terms of GDP per capita, and as such are not eligible for as much money as we did in the past. So I think the overall levels of investment have been growing, but I think it's not only about the money or the amount, but it's also about the quality of investment. And I think here we probably need to have a more in-depth discussion, including Slovakia, about how the public money is spent, in what areas. Are those areas really the ones which are drivers of economic growth and competitiveness? Is enough money going to improvement of education? Is there enough money for startups? I see our friends from GA Drilling here, and companies of this type who have the potential to really drive the competitiveness and innovation in Slovakia. Is there enough support for this type of companies, or are we still focusing more on kind of traditional dinosaurs who may not be the drivers of the future innovation in Slovakia? So I think that this is something which requires much more discussion in the future.
So, how do you determine the quality of an investment?
You're asking big questions today. Depends on how, we obviously try to get additionality into every project that we do, but to be quite honest, as a free market liberal, I do find it interesting that in the statutes of our bank, it says that we are a non-profit bank. So we're not trying to make money, so that's why we call it surplus. And we usually make surplus about 1.5–2 billion euros per year. But of course, that's not the standard by which we go. We do not go either by the standard of volumes. In other words, how much do we lend per year? We look around and see which projects have been successful and which have not. The simple philosophy, and this touches on your question about the diversity of the different regions. I mean, our aim is to promote and help and facilitate the real economy, growth and jobs, to use political cliche, but also cohesion. So when there are countries that might be lagging behind in some specific areas, we look at that as one criteria and think, okay, how can you help here? We have 4 basic areas where we work. One is very broad, it's SMEs, so that can be almost anyone. Second one is innovation. Third one is infrastructure, and the fourth one is environment and climate. And then we go through the project, and the scrutiny that we have, the due diligence is tremendous. You get a loan officer, a lawyer, a scientist, an engineer, a banker, a risk manager, or a compliance officer on each case to have a look, okay, how can we work on this? Is it good? Is it bad? Do we make value added? So how do we determine success? Well, I don't know, by example. I mean, travel anywhere around Europe, go across a bridge, on a highway, on a railway, at an airport. It will probably have been financed by the EIB. And the quality of it would not have been as good had not the EIB intervened. Other examples, I don't know if this is good or bad, but you might have heard of a company called Izettle, which does this sort of credit card machines, if you will, in Sweden. We financed them, and now they went public, sold to the Americans for a few billion euros. Is that success or not? I'd say yeah, probably it is success. When I go and visit different European companies, for me, most of them are success stories. So it's very difficult to pinpoint and say that this is the recipe of success. But I do think we make a lot of value added, and we make it possible for companies to grow, and that in and of itself I think is a good thing.
If I may just on this point, coming closer to Slovakia, what type of investments and how to bring quality type of investments, at least from our point of view, to the development, because as was discussed, in the future there will be less grant type of money, public money from Europe. So we are now talking, and also when I was in Poland, a lot of discussion was about so-called smart cohesion, or how to utilize these cohesion funds and support in a smart way. And talking about smart, we are now doing a lot in Central Europe in developing the concept and financing the concept of smart cities and smart regions. And this is about how do you bring technology in the way which would support basically better conditions for people to utilize technology and to use private sector investment together with the public money from governments, local governments, regions, as well as institutions like EIB for such smart solutions. So here, because we are, as Alex explained, we are a bank which is mostly focusing on large projects. Here we are working with the National Development Bank in Slovakia, the SZRB, Slovenská záručná rozvojová banka, to create an investment platform, basically an investment fund, which would support these kind of smart solutions on the local level. And I think here the quality of investment would come together with the volume, but it's more about quality, about new intelligent approach to local development.
Quality of investment is obviously important. I was more thinking about distinguishing between the dinosaurs, as you mentioned, the sort of traditional way of thinking about investment into infrastructure, highways and stuff like that, versus the new economy, the digital markets and so on. So what is basically sort of your thinking? What is more important, to be very simplistic about it, investment into the infrastructure, or focusing on something that is more intangible, more perhaps sustainable?
I think cohesion countries or regions, country like Slovakia, it's very difficult, impossible I think to say that we will focus only on these intangibles and kind of smart and high-tech investments and not looking at the classical infrastructure, because we know, at least in Slovakia, that if we do not finish, for example, the connection, highway connection from Bratislava to Košice, the D1, famous D1 highway, then we will not be able to bring economic development and balance the regional development in the east and the west. So we do need, and I think this is why cohesion countries and regions are different, because we do need to go in parallel with the kind of classical infrastructure development and support, but at the same time to support those drivers of economic growth and competitiveness, innovation, which are necessary to position these countries in a way which would make them more competitive. So it's really kind of balance between the two. But I think that in terms of the utilization of EU funds and the public money, we are still skewed much more to the classical infrastructure and whatever you call it, dinosaurs or whatever, and much less for those innovation-driven areas of economy.
Isn't the Highway D1 basically an example of doing less with more, though?
Good question, but not for me. So.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I think Vasily is absolutely right. You know, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But in many ways, it's not an either/or question. It's kind of, you know, you do both. And of course, inside the bank, you know, there's an ongoing debate on what type of projects we focus on. You know, there's a classic north-south divide sometimes. You know, some of our southern colleagues, they want to focus more on SMEs, or sometimes on, you know, big size infrastructure projects down in the south. Some northerners think that, well, as a matter of fact, you know, we should do more on research and development and on innovation and digital startups and so on and so forth. And then we have these debates, and then, you know, we find different types of solutions. My own take is, if you want my 2 cents worth, I mean, if you want to do the mega trends, you need to do two things. One is to deal with issues linked to healthcare and aging. You know, we all age. We're going to get, you know, the life cycle. My kids are now 14 and 16. Life expectancy 105 to 110. Their life cycle is going to be completely different from ours. Or Vasil and I, we're middle-aged men, right? So, you know,
In good shape.
in good shape, very good shape. We're mammals, middle-aged men in lycra. In any case, I'm thinking, you know, when we grew up, it used to be, life has 3 phases, right? It's study, work, and retire. Now for my kids, it's a completely different ballgame. You know, I tell them, it's study, work, study again, work, study again, work, die. You know, kind of a thing. So, you know, forget the retirement bit. And you know, you have to be innovative. So that's what I'm saying, that, you know, anything that is dealing with health and aging is going to be a booming business, right? Then the second area where you want to focus on as well is climate and environment, because that, you know, it touches all of us in one way or another, not only future of mankind, but if we are to have a sustainable planet, if we want to meet the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, if we want to continue to habit this planet, then we're going to have technological solutions. And obviously we keep on pushing them. Sometimes they come through regulation, as we've done a lot in Europe, in forcing us to a certain mode. At other times they are born out of, you know, free enterprise and markets. And our job as the EIB is to sort of, you know, surf around and try to find the right projects and help them forward. Sometimes they might have to do with solar power, at other times there's some kind of a health tech solution, etc., etc. But the lovely thing with the job is, and I'm sure Vasil agrees as well, is that, you know, instead of being there as an economy minister or finance minister, you know, pushing austerity and regulation, you're there basically picking and choosing projects which at the end of the day, most of them are going to be successful in one way or another. So it's kind of a, you know, it's a good job. It's a fun. It's rewarding, and, you know, it's kind of a fun job to do as well. Trust me, I always tell my former colleagues, you know, what's the best job title in the world, right? Former Prime Minister. But I would now say banker, right, Vasa?
Yeah, I guess.
You brought up big issues such as the silver economy, small medium enterprises. Let's start with aging population. These days there is quite a vigorous debate in Slovakia about the retirement age. Not to get too specific, I can see your apprehension, but let me put it in a macroeconomic way. An older society has more propensity to save. Where do you get the money to invest?
Well, yeah, I mean, the last thing I'm going to do is to give advice to the Slovakian government about a pension age. I must, however, say that I'm quite proud that my stint as Prime Minister, we were able to come up with a final agreement on the pension age in Finland and the flexibility. But it's always something which is very emotional, and even if you're just changing the age by 1 or 2 years or decimals, it becomes quite complicated. The bottom line is that probably in the future, if we want to continue the European welfare states as we know them, we're going to have to find different sustainable models of economic growth and also of public finance. And that's why I personally think that the whole notion of my children having a retirement age at 68 is utopia. It's going to be completely different. They're not going to have long careers working for only one employer. They're probably going to be self-employed a lot. They're going to have many jobs at once. They're going to be doing a lot of their own pension gathering as life goes along. My father is a good example. My father's 83, right? By the way, he's dating Miss Finland from 1957. But nevertheless,
Is it genetic?
It's how it goes. They're both widowers and they're lovely. But anyway, my dad is actually is the chief scout, talent scout of the National Hockey League here in Europe. So every ice hockey player that goes to the NHL in the US or Canada goes through him. Okay, the Stastny brothers didn't. That was before his time, but nevertheless, they do. And when I asked him, he just signed a new 2-year contract with the NHL, which I think is great, since 1983. So he's got the longest standing contract with the NHL. I asked him, Dad, aren't you going to retire? And he sort of looks at me, how can I do that? That would destroy the public finances in Finland, wouldn't it? And I think, I think we need a change of a mindset with the whole pension debate. The pension age was actually determined by Bismarck in the 1860s. And I think he put it down at 60 at the time when life expectancy was 59. And we really need to start thinking out of the box when it comes to pensions and public finance as such. But having been in politics, a former politician, I fully understand how difficult it is to have that debate. But there's going to be a generation shift, and I don't know where that shift is going to happen. But we're going to have a future probably without traditional pensions.
Do you want to weigh in on the pension debate?
Don't do it, Boston. Don't do it.
I really don't want to, but I just want to say that when I was in the Ministry of Finance, I think there was an agreement on a very good formula, which is so-called automat, which was connecting the retirement age with the average life expectancy. I think this was a very good way how to get a very broad consensus agreement on this. I think it's very bad when these things become politicized. So of course I don't want to comment, but I think there was a very good solution, and hopefully we will come back to some consensus soon.
Well, basically, the best retirement strategy, apart from having a lot of kids, is taking care of yourself, investing, which is something that in Slovakia is not very developed, let's say. What are the challenges for sort of developing the mentality, or how do you go about changing the mentality of a nation that has not been used to investing, that is not very much used to putting its money into investment funds, let's say?
Well, I think it's not only a problem of Slovakia, I think it's a problem of whole Europe, because our mentality is more related to the banking sector. It's more to utilize the banking products, the loans, and then repay. It's not the capital markets mentality, which is typical for the United States, for Anglo-Saxon, let's say, culture. And I think we are suffering from this fact. And as you know, in the United States, 80% of investments are funded through capital markets, only 20% through banking. In Europe, it's just vice versa. It's 20% from capital markets, 80% from the banking industry. So, and the banking industry, of course, is very much linked to the government bonds and interlinked with the state in Europe. So it's very fragile. You can see also in Italy now and so on. So I think and this is something which the European Commission is pushing in the right way, which is creation of the European Capital Market Union. This is, I think, very good exercise. We do need to strengthen the role of investment funds, the role of stock exchanges in the process of investments. I'm very happy I see here IPM representatives, which is part of that industry. And when I was Minister in Economy, but before Minister of Finances, you know, we came up with the legislation, as for Alex's information, when we tried to kind of copy the Luxembourg structure, you know, this SE, what's called basically the legal structures which create opportunity for alternative investment funds to grow and to generate investments into, especially into the high-tech industry. And I'm very happy to see that some actually did come, like IPM, but they do help to promote such companies as GA Drilling, or maybe I can say that you were today with Aeromobile and spend some time with this famous Slovak startup. So I think people need to your question, I think people need to change their mindset. They need to see successes. They need to see the fact that such companies as Aeromobile or GA Drilling grow, that they generate revenues and generate actually a nice profit for investors, including people, and that this is actually a good way to spend the money that people save during the lifetime and then in retirement. So I think it's a gradual process, it's mental change, it will take time, but I think we need to push in this direction.
So one of the focuses of the European Investment Bank is small and medium-sized enterprises, which often have quite difficult time getting loans, getting capital. What are the projects, what are the strategies you try to develop to bring capital to small and medium-sized enterprises?
Sure. I mean, first of all, over 30% of the business that we do are in the field of SMEs. So there will have been millions of SMEs that we have touched upon in one way or other. And you could say that there are two basic strands that we work with. One is our subsidiary part of our group called the EIF, European Investment Fund. And they do a lot of small scale, also large scale, but small scale equity loans. So this is a different type of a product where we go in, we invest in the equity and we let the SMEs work. Then the other strand that we work is FC, or the Juncker Plan, European Fund for Strategic Investment. And there we either give direct loans or indirect loans through an intermediary. So for instance, we might go ahead and say, okay, here we take 4 Slovakian banks. We give a full guarantee of 150 million euros, and those banks must then, based on our conditions, give loans to SMEs of sizes X, Y, and Z. And that would be, one way of doing it. So, and then finally, of course, we have our SME window. So we do a lot of work with SMEs, but the problem, of course, with SMEs is always it's such a big term as well. So you can kind of brand anything as an SME. But what I've found over the years is that more that we talk about the EIB in public and the more people know about us, the more interested they get, and then suddenly we have more and more people knocking on our doors.
Maybe just to add one other element of SME support, which I think is also interesting, which EIB does provide, which is the quasi-equity, the growth, equity growth financing, and it's very much linked to the issue of competitiveness of Europe, because as we know, Europe is producing quite a lot of very interesting and dynamic startups like Automobile. But where we face a problem is in the growth part, when they grow from startup to scale up, and when they need not 1 to 3 million euro, but they need 10, 20, 50 million euro of risk financing, and this is when Europe doesn't have this type of financial infrastructure to fill this gap, and that's why EIB, where we are in the situation where we cannot invest directly into equity of companies, so we came up with the concept of quasi-equity or debt equity, which is exactly targeting this kind of scale-ups in the growth phase, where we provide the debt, which however is structured in the way that it behaves almost like equity, and it's structured according to the needs of the company. It is flexible in terms of repayment schedule, in terms of the interest rate and its flexibility. So I would say a very friendly way of providing that equity, which otherwise is, as I understand from the startup industry, it's like from the commercial side, it's like a credit card. You go to this only when it's very bad, because the interest rates are extremely high if you don't pay. But we came up with the product which is really friendly to this growth equity, growth startup part. So I think that's one additional area where we support SMEs, especially in the innovation area.
So obviously, another sort of fragmentation we see in Europe is that small and medium enterprises are not always the most productive. At least in Slovakia, they mostly belong to the less productive companies. Is that perhaps somehow caused by the lack of funding, the lack of capital, the fragmentation of the capital markets union? Or to put it another way, would our companies be more productive if the capital markets union was already finished?
To be quite honest, I don't think we can generalize like that. You can't say that an SME is by definition non-productive. I would disagree with that hypothesis. One might say that actually huge international multinational corporations are less productive than SMEs. I also think it's very difficult to go ahead and say that because of a capital markets union, these SMEs will actually, and the funding that we give these SMEs might be productive or more. There's no causality, I would argue, in that. I think what we try to do in Europe is really on two scales. One is regulation, and the whole idea of the single market, obviously, freedom of the goods, services, money and labor, is to allow for companies, be they from Slovakia or Finland or Sweden or Ireland, to do free enterprise as they best can. And for that we need a regulatory framework. I know that European law directives and regulations are an infinite source of jokes, because you can always twist and turn the stories around, but the truth is that as a matter of fact quite often it works. It's much better to have one set of rules rather than 28 sets of rules. And the second thing we can do apart from regulation is the finance bit, and that's where the EIB comes in. And I mean, how many of you knew anything about the EIB before you came in here? Well, some people do, yeah. But I didn't. I'm a complete EU nerd, and I've worked in almost all the EU institutions, and I didn't know that the EIB is the biggest multilateral bank in the world. 3 times bigger than the World Bank and 10 times bigger than the EBRD. I didn't know that we put out loans of 80 billion euros a year. Quite a lot of money. Finnish national budget, government budget, is approximately 55 billion euros. our GDP per annum is 200 billion, and here we have a bank, bang, which is putting down, 80 billion of hard cash for companies, be they SMEs or otherwise. So I think, we can't, it's so difficult to generalize. I also belong to the category of people who say that, we can't be there choosing champions. We don't know which companies are going to succeed or not. We just have a look whether this is financially viable, whether it works. Sometimes we succeed at other times we fail. So that's the starting point. I sometimes think, we in Europe we're sort of quite good at self-bashing. We're always criticizing, we're not doing that well, and this and that. And I think sometimes we should just stop whining and get on with it. I actually think that we're doing pretty well in Europe overall. And as a matter of fact, I think this is probably for another debate, but post-Brexit and post-Donald Trump, there's a power vacuum to be filled there, and I think Europe is doing quite a good job in trying to fill it.
Quite optimistic words. Let's move on to the favorite part of any host's job, and that is the audience questions. So if anyone wants to ask, feel free. I'll give you the microphone.
Hello, my name is Jakub Wiśniewski. I'm from here, from Globsec. And my question is rather for economists, not EIB officials. I live in a country which is part of the Eurozone, and when I open the news, I hear about leaders of a country which is the third biggest economy in the Eurozone, not being proponents of the euro currency, to put it mildly. Should I be worried about the future of the euro currency?
Well, it's obviously been quite difficult for Vasil and myself to give sort of definite answers on these things, not least because we're actually not involved directly in the political debate. But as a private person, I can say that the European Union usually advances in 3 stages. Stage number 1 is crisis, stage number 2 is chaos, and stage number 3 is suboptimal solution. And I think, this is probably what we're going to see again. When I look at the financial crisis, come sovereign debt crisis, come euro crisis, there were moments where I, as a government minister, whether finance, foreign or prime, was losing faith. I wasn't sure whether we're going to make it. But at the end of the day, we did. First there was 2-pack legislation, then there was 6-pack, then there was the European Stability Mechanism, then there was banking union, then were the rescue packages. No matter what kind of government we had, it's part of democracy. And then modern liberal democracy, especially in the West, provides for rather messy election results. But we should get used to this, we're going to have something like 15 elections by the end of 2019, including the European elections. And you're going to see more. It's going to fluctuate, it's going to oscillate. Of course, for Italy, should you be worried about the euro? I'd say no. We have the backstops to deal with these types of situations. We've proven our worth in big crises. You can obviously hype it up, I think so-called economists like Krugman and others. Do you remember what they were talking about the euro and how it was going to collapse, not tomorrow, but today in a few hours? And they were all proven wrong. So, the EU is a crisis management institution, and we're able to deal with things. I'd also like to say that with power comes responsibility. I can take, and sorry for answering a bit long, but I'll take Finland as an example because it's the country that I know best. The True Finns were, for all intents and purposes, an anti-European populist party, right? Did very well in the elections 2011, didn't want to take responsibility because they knew that we'd have to bail out Greece. 2015 in the elections, they did well again, finished 3rd, and they couldn't say no to responsibility anymore. But they had 3, and this comes to the question of responsibility. They had 3 election promises. Number 1, no more austerity. Number 2, no more money to Greece. And number 3, no more immigration. Now, what was the first thing I did as finance minister? Probably pushed through the toughest austerity package that we've seen in Finnish economic history. Number two, I flew together with Peter Kazimir to Brussels and bailed out Greece for a third time. And number three, as things would have it, an oddity of history, we had the biggest asylum crisis since World War II. Now, with power comes responsibility, and when you face problems of this magnitude, you cannot anymore say that, we're not going to be in the euro and so on and so forth. You start looking for solutions. And for me, the euro is more of a solution rather than a problem.
You already met me, Alex Martin with Globsec. The main point of contention now for the budget 2020 discussion is the direct link to rule of law. How will that affect the investment policy of EIB, if there will be any type of influence if that link stays in place?
I will try to take this because actually this primarily potentially affecting the cohesion countries, and we know which ones. But it is a rule overall, and I think that, as we said, the EIB, we are policy takers, and the European Commission is the policy maker. So we just take this as a fact. I think obviously we'll have to look at the way how the European Commission is going to apply this new regulation in practice, because sometimes much easier to put it on paper and declare and then much more difficult to actually apply in reality. I think what will be maybe even more important for us is another link, which is the link to the so-called European semester and country-specific recommendations. These are, I think, important documents, and when I was member of the European Economic and Finance Council and Committee and Euro Working Group of Deputy Ministers of Finance, there was a lot of time spent on developing, I think, very well-designed structural recommendations for structural changes in the member states, but frankly, nobody really paid too much attention to them because there was no fiscal pressure how to implement. And I think now by connecting these structural reforms and the European semester, the changes which are proposed to the utilization of the EU funds creates an opportunity to really push for such structural changes which are needed. And I think we as an investment bank of Europe, the bank where we also want to make sure that our investments support the European economy and the competitiveness of the European economy we will attune very much to this connectivity to this semester.
Hi, Vladislava Bubulova from Globsec as well. Actually, my question is, what are some of the challenges that you foresee for the bank itself, given the global situation, and specifically looking at some of the policies, for example, enacted by President Trump recently?
Trump is your favorite politician.
Trump is my favorite, yeah. Let's take them one piece at a time and fairly shortly. Number one is obviously Brexit. As I said earlier, it provides a capital gap of 3.5 billion euros. I think we solved that, and we can retain and maintain the business model of the bank. Number two is the MFF. Today, if you're an EU geek and nerd, you will have noticed that the Commission came out with the part of its MFF proposal which deals with an EU Invest Fund. And there, for us, we think it's a great thing, but we still think that the administrative or management structure that the Commission proposes is not necessarily ideal. The Commission is an administration, a bureaucracy, and I mean that in a positive sense. It's not a bank. We are, and we've been managing the Juncker Plan and EFSI. And our message, of course, is that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Third observation linked to Donald Trump. I mentioned earlier that I think the United States is basically not necessarily exiting the world stage, but we're starting to live in a post-multilateral world, a very transactionalist world where the United States doesn't necessarily believe in the international rule of law. It doesn't believe in international institutions, be that linked to climate change or the WTO or NATO or the European Union for that matter. And this will probably mean in the long term that someone has to step in, and I somehow don't see anyone else stepping into that space from the Western world that can be more, I think, credible than the European Union. That's why we're doing major bilateral trade deals right now with the likes of Canada, Mexico, Japan, Korea, India, you name it, and we're going to get more and more of those. I think Donald Trump has had a remarkable capacity to piss off most of his allies. The latest example obviously is the preparations of the G7, or actually the G7 meeting, which became very much a G6, against one. And to see that happening in such a short term is mind-boggling for someone who's grown up believing strongly in three things: liberal democracy, market economy, and globalization. And someone who's grown up with liberal world order pretty much led by the United States since 1989. As an eternal optimist, I then say, well, this is Europe's moment. This is when we get involved. What kind of ramifications does this have on the bank? I'll give you one example, obviously, is Iran. And the unilateral withdrawal of Donald Trump and the United States from the JCPOA nuclear deal. And here, our president, if I'm not mistaken, has today, in a Bloomberg interview, noted that as much as we would like to help, we will not be able to do that. And the reasons for it are rather obvious, that you cannot put a bank like the EIB onto the sanctions list in the United States. And because 10% of our institutional investors come from the United States, and 30% of the bonds that we have floating around in the world are dollar-issued bonds. So, we're trying to do our best to navigate in this, but, I think Vasil put it absolutely correctly. We're decision takers, not decision makers, and we live accordingly.
I'll try to pitch in with my Globsec colleagues here. I'm Marian Bocek from IPM. Thanks, Vasil, for the nice words. To me, one way to actually achieve more with less is actually via education reform. And in Finland, we've seen a very progressive sort of phenomenon-based learning system that has been slowly implemented. Do you see, Alexandra, and also a question to you, Vasil, this is a future of education across Europe, and what is sort of the European Commission and EIB stance on this innovation in education itself?
Yeah, I mean, we were actually talking about it with the Vice Prime Minister and the Finance Minister earlier, because I understand that there's been a lot of talk about revamping the education system in Slovakia and talking about it. It's always obviously a very emotional subject, because education is basically all we have. It's part of our, in many ways, DNA and our heritage. Now, Finland was very lucky in the sense that we had reformed our education system by giving teachers more autonomy to teach the curriculum, by having slightly smaller class sizes, by having well-educated teachers, just when the PISA studies started to come out. And then we started to hit the top year in and year out. Now, you can have many opinions about the PISA method. It's a way of testing, if you will. But Finland got lucky in the sense that then suddenly we had the brand as the best education system in the world. And granted, it's not bad. I've visited 150 schools since 2004, so I've basically seen it all, you could say. I think innovative education is the key. Give you one example. I visited a school, went to the classroom of fourth graders. The teacher was very innovative, albeit he was my age, middle age, if you will. His student did not have a direct curriculum. He didn't give any lessons. On the iPad, or whatever pad they had, each kid had one, they had different tasks that they had to do during the week. And the basic system was that you had a whole bunch of sofas and lazy boys and fat boys or whatever they're called, and the kids were them doing their tasks, and they'd come to the teacher and ask, they'd go to another student, there would be a game, and this was the way of learning. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. So I think the way in which we teach, the instruments that we have, they will continue to change throughout. I actually think, to take it one step further, I'm not 100% sure that we will follow the path of education that we used to, in the sense that, you know, starting school at the age of 6 and 7, and then, you know, going through high school and graduating 17, 18, 19, then going to university, then doing a BA, MA, and a PhD. I think it's going to be much more sort of learning for life type of an issue, and I kind of welcome that. I'm very Aristotelian in my thinking. I really think that, you know, the source of happiness is this sort of eternal learning. You pick up new things all the time. And whatever the school system is, I think it should have one aim. It should not be to teach you to memorize things or learn a certain set of rules. It should teach you how to learn. You know, that's the thing. How to pick up things, how to analyze, and how to use those tools for life. Final point on this. I read both of Yuval Harari's book, Homo Sapiens and Homo Deus, and then I went to listen to him in London. And he told us that he's often asked the question that, you know, what should a youngster study? And I think his answer was very good and general. He said, number one, study how to learn. So, continuous learning. Number two, emotional intelligence, how you behave with other people and human beings. As we go more and more towards robotization, I think the notion of empathy will be more important than ever, although when on social media you don't seem to see it, but nevertheless, that's the way to go. And the third one is self-management, and that's linked to, you know, how you maintain yourself, how you sleep, how you eat, how you exercise, how you learn. And these were the three sort of golden rules. So learn how to learn, empathy, and manage yourself, and I think you get quite far in life with that.
Very briefly, because I think what Alex said makes a lot of sense, and it's already great advice. You should be probably also advisor to our Minister of Education or government on education. But education for me is really the core. That's the base of long-term competitiveness of any nation. And I think this is one of the areas where Slovakia really needs to do much more. In a way, when because some of my kids, they grew up in the United States, and it seems to me that Slovakia is like opposite of United States. As we know, whether in the United States the elementary education is awful, in most cases, the public schools, if you compare them to Slovak, because we inherited some good education on the elementary level, in Slovakia I think we are doing quite well. It could be better, certainly more creative teaching, as you mentioned, more flexibility for teachers, better salaries, probably too many schools, but unfortunately not enough political will, encouraged to rather focus on better paid teachers than the number of teachers. But okay, I think the elementary education part is more or less okay. But then when you go higher, we get less and less successful. As you know, there was a reform about the introduction of a dual education, connecting the secondary schools to economy. But what I'm hearing is that this is not really doing as well as it was intended, and there are different reasons why this is not happening. There is still less or not enough connectivity between the secondary education and the needs of the market economy. And I think where we are losing completely is the higher education. Just look at how many Slovak students are moving to Czech Republic. Tens of thousands of Slovaks studying in the Czech Republic, while I think the level, the quality of professors is more or less the same. I think we really lost on the investments into education. Our dormitories are awful. For young students, it really matters in what situation, what environment they stay and live. And also, yeah, I was in Poland. If you go to major universities, you see that almost every university has a technology park, has a small innovation center, has a startup part next to the university. Here in Slovakia, we are, I don't know how long, but our Jaspers program of the EIB has been helping with this, but already maybe 5 or 7 years we are talking about the joint technology center between the technical university and the community university. And then it's not happening just for bureaucratic reasons. No. So I think that this is one area. If we don't change it, we will just fall behind Europe, and we'll really endanger our competitiveness. So I'm very happy that the new minister is coming up with some new proposals, new strategy. But in Slovakia, we always have a problem between strategies. We have quite many strategies and good ideas, but then implementation is not as good. So I hope that this time we will succeed.
Thank you very much for an inspiring debate. Let's hope that the European economic outlook is a little bit better than the weather today. Alexander Staub from the European Investment Bank and Basil Hudak from the European Investment Bank as well. Thank you very much for attending.